Good afternoon, everybody. I think that we'll get started. I know that the awards were going over, but it looks like we have enough people to get started, and we don't want to be too late. We do have a half-hour break in between, so I don't think we'll be too time-pressed. We'll just shorten the break a little bit. Welcome to the panel supporting planning and undertaking audiovisual preservation projects. And this is session 210 and 310. And it's a dual panel, so this is part one of two. My name's Jesse Johnston, and I'm with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And with my co-panelists here, we've organized this session for you today. And before introducing the presenters, I want to just take a moment to say a little bit about the goals of these sessions. Our aim here is to offer an overview of support available for the preservation of audiovisual materials, which have been a medium of significance in recording and documenting Native American culture since the late 19th century. While many such recordings were made by community outsiders, such as ethnologists and anthropologists, many also represent community perspectives. And regardless of their provenance, we believe that these sorts of materials constitute a significant record of and for Native Americans, and we suspect that while many of these materials, particularly the older stuff, are in federal collections, which our panelists today will be discussing and have discussed previously at ATALM, we also know that many TALMs hold collections of audiovisual materials, and these present a stewardship challenge. We were just talking up here amongst the three of us about the special challenges that audiovisual formats face. They're often not at the center of library missions, and they pose a challenge to staff who are not necessarily well-versed in taking care of them. So, and they also face a shortening time horizon of obsolescence and degradation that poses a real challenge to rescuing content that's held on such audiovisual carriers. So, what we want to do today is to focus on some ways to support AV preservation initiatives, and I'll be talking in particular about federal grants and financial resources that can support projects in audiovisual preservation. We'll also talk about project planning and management and present a few case studies of notable projects that have preserved audiovisual recordings of significant Native American content. And we also want to complement these with real-world examples and advice for carrying out audiovisual collecting and preservation projects, including resources for documenting, describing, sustaining, and preserving oral histories and other audiovisual collections. So our panelists today include representatives from a number of national-level institutions that either carry out or support work in this area, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian, and the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. So for the first session, three of us are going to speak, and I'll introduce the speakers at the beginning of each session. So I'll introduce the three of us first, and then I'll introduce, come on in, Maggie and Guha on the second session. So as I said, my name's Jesse Johnston. I'm with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I work in the Division of Preservation and Access with grants that serve archives, libraries, museums, and other cultural heritage organizations. I have a background in ethnomusicology and did a PhD at the University of Michigan, and previously worked at the Center for Folklife at the Smithsonian and the Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Our other two panelists on the first half of this session are Brian Carpenter. He's an archivist at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, where from 2008 to 2014 he digitized and cataloged the 3,000-plus hour collection of audio recordings relating to indigenous people of the Americas. He's now senior archivist at the newly established Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at APS, which focuses on supporting community-based linguistic and cultural initiatives by returning these and other digitized materials to their source communities. And Pam Wintle of the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives is the founding archivist of the Smithsonian's Human Studies Film Archives and has been active in the moving image archival community for over 35 years. In 2009, she was instrumental in having the John Marshall Juhwansi film and video collection placed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. Pam has received a number of grants from the National Film Preservation Foundation to care for collections, and in 2014 received the Silver Light Award from the Association of Moving Image Archivists for service to the community. She also serves on the board of Northeast Historic Films. So we're each going to take about 15 to 20 minutes and talk to you, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion after that. So I'm going to be talking about federal support for preservation of Native American-related audiovisual collections, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is where I'm working. So one of the first things I want to suggest is that if you're looking for grant funding, you want to find out a little bit about the organization. What is it? What does it do? What does it focus on? Who can you talk to at the organization? And NEH is not necessarily an organization that you would immediately say, I have an audiovisual preservation project that I want to do. I'm going to go to NEH. So let me tell you a little bit about what NEH is and what we do and how audiovisual materials fit into that. The NEH is a independent federal agency founded in 1965, and our mission is to promote excellence in the humanities and to reach people with humanities-related experiences in their communities. We award grants through national peer-reviewed programs, and most NEH grants actually go to cultural institutions like libraries, archives, museums, radio stations, public television stations, universities, etc. NEH's mandate is to focus on the humanities, which means that we focus on what colleges often describe as the liberal arts. History is sort of one of the largest catch-all disciplines within the humanities, but we also focus on linguistics, literature, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, social sciences with humanistic content, and history, theory, and criticism of the arts. So I took all of the disciplines that we're supposed to serve according to our legislation and put them into a word cloud. And like I said, history comes up pretty big, but you can see that arts, archaeology, anthropology, music, and literature and linguistics have a lot of content that could be used by people in those disciplines that would be carried on audiovisual media. And so although we often focus on textual analysis in the humanities, it is highly likely that people in the humanities would be working with audiovisual collections. And so that's where our interest comes in. The endowment is organized in a number of different offices and divisions, and the funds at the endowment are allocated across these different divisions. And I'll just point out one of these, which is where I work, which is preservation and access. The idea here is that preservation and access is basically serving these other areas by providing basic materials or primary sources that people working in these other disciplines, whether it be in education, whether it be researching to write monographs or produce new knowledge in other areas, or to produce public programming that might be serving public radio or television, would have materials to work with. And so you might think of us kind of being at the bottom of the pyramid, and for those of you working in archives, libraries, and museums, this is the division in NEH to look at. So where does audiovisual fit in? I already said this. The Division of Preservation and Access is one of NEH's grant-making divisions, and we've made a number of different awards in various areas that support audiovisual preservation, and I'm going to talk about those through a few of our specific programs. Currently, we run 8 programs, and these serve different areas, so I'm going to focus on the ones that I think would be of highest interest and have the most interesting examples to highlight some of the issues we're talking about in the panel today. But of of highest importance, because this extends across all of our grant programs, is that we have identified through a strategic planning process over the last couple of years 3 critical areas that we do want to solicit applications and make support in. One of those is preventive conservation, another is digital preservation, and the third is audiovisual preservation. So we've been looking around and keeping track of what sort of reports and research people are putting out, everything from the Library of Congress to the American Council of Learned Societies to the Film and Recording Academy. And seen that audiovisual resources face a particular challenge, which is the degradation and obsolescence of those materials, and they're also breaking down in collections. And so we're hoping to support the long-term preservation of more humanities-related content that would be located on audiovisual media. So let me tell you about just a few of the programs, and I'll give you an example in each about that shows you sort of ways that it's served Native American communities. Preservation Assistance Grants is one of our longer-running programs. It's been going for about 15 years, and the goal of Preservation Assistance Grants is really capacity building. Whether that be bringing in a consultant who can advise a local institution to help do a preservation survey or institute an environmental monitoring program or developing a disaster plan, or it could be educating staff or sending staff to get more education in current collections management activities. There are relatively small grants for NEH, up to $6,000, and there's an annual deadline in early May each year. So the next deadline will be coming up in May of 2016. Many tribal organizations, including archives, libraries, and museums, have received support through the Preservation Assistance Grants program. There's just a few examples here represented by these graphics. One example that I'll talk about is the Barona Cultural Center. And to help preserve a part of Barona's history, the Cultural Center and Museum there began a digitization project for their entire media and audiovisual archives collection in 2011. The museum's archives contain recordings of important events that helped shape Barona's history and culture, including oral histories and other forms of cultural expression. The import of the recordings for the community was captured by Director Emeritus Cheryl Hinton, who said that the transcripts of old recordings simply do not capture the gestures and personality traits or tones of voice of those who were recorded. If we rely on transcripts alone, much information is lost. So they made this argument in their application to NEH, and were awarded a PAG grant. And although PAG grants do not support the digitization of materials per se, and they did not do so at Barona, the grant in 2010 did enable the center to survey their holdings, to determine what the preservation needs were, and also to begin prioritizing materials for a later digitization project that's currently ongoing. If any of you were at last year's ATALM and came to the NEH session, you may have met Cheryl Hinton, and she talked about their current program, which is ongoing. Another program that I'll talk about is the Humanities Collections program, and this really supports a variety of sorts of work on audiovisual collections and any other sorts of collections. It can support work like processing an archival collection, cataloging collections, or digitizing collections for preservation purposes. It can also support the creation of access tools like dictionaries, databases, encyclopedias, and materials of that sort. This also has an annual deadline, which is in July each year. And I don't know what the exact day is, but the next upcoming deadline is in July of next year. And I'll focus on just two related projects that have received support here. Over the past year, the NEH has made 2 awards that support the digital reformatting and preservation of significant audio recordings of Native American cultural expression that was recorded on wax cylinders in the early 20th century. One of these awards is through this Humanities Collections program, and the second is through the Documenting Endangered Languages program, which I'll talk about next. So the first of these, supported through the program here, was an award to Indiana University, which is currently transferring, or will start soon, transferring and digitally preserving nearly 7,000 wax cylinder recordings at the Archives of Traditional Music. These comprise 160 ethnographic collections from all over the world, recorded between 1893 and 1938, and contain primarily unique and irreplaceable recordings made during the very beginnings of American anthropology, folklore, ethnomusicology, and linguistics. So this joint effort is between the Archives of Traditional Music and the Media Digitization and Preservation Initiative at Indiana, and will come at an important time to make sure that the content that's recorded on these on these cylinders is preserved for a longer time and also made available to people who want to listen to it as appropriate according to community protocols. And the third program that I'll talk about is Documenting Endangered Languages. This is a cooperative program that the NSF and the NEH began in 2004 in recognition of the need to document languages. You may know that linguists estimate that of the world's 7,000 languages, half or more may no longer be spoken or be completely forgotten in the next century. And so, in order to address this issue, documentation and preservation was seen as one way that we could help ameliorate the problem, with a particular focus on languages that have few or no surviving speakers. And the program awards fellowships to linguists who can help to document languages, and also to organizations that can work with communities to help to revitalize languages. These are also competitive awards that are administered by both the NEH and NSF. They can be up to 3 years for organizational awards, most of which are administered by the NEH. And deadlines for this program are in September. Now, documenting endangered languages may not be an exclusively audiovisual focused activity, but we have identified some priorities in this program that do encompass audiovisual materials, particularly fieldwork that's recording language and speech in digital audio and video formats. To prepare other scholarly or dictionary materials, and also to digitize and preserve previously collected materials. So let me, and I should say we do have a priority in this program as well on Native American languages. So you see the bottom bullet point here is that approximately, in the decade that the program has been active so far, approximately 60 of the awards have been made to support the study and documentation of Native American languages in the United States. So the second award of the two that I was speaking about earlier also is for wax cylinder preservation. And this was an award to the University of California at Berkeley, which was announced just earlier this year, to support their preservation of language documentation throughout California and the American West since 1901. So for the past 55 years, this work has largely been undertaken by linguists affiliated with the Survey of California and Other Indian Languages, or SCOIL, at Berkeley. And the products of this research are held at the Bancroft Library and the Hearst Museum, and comprise about 3,000 wax cylinders. And they're going to be using non-contact technology called IRENE to image the surface of these cylinders digitally and preserve those images, and then extract sound signals from those images. This will be a 3-year project that Berkeley is undertaking. And in fact, it builds on a previous grant that they received from NEH through this program as well in 2007, which was to create the California Language Archive, which is an online resource that improves access to linguistic materials held at Berkeley, including fieldwork notes, manuscripts, and audio recordings that document over 130 American Indian languages. So we hope that eventually some of those audio files may be integrated into this larger resource. So that concludes a brief look at NEH programs. There are, however, of course, many other ways to seek support through various federal resources and other foundations and other institutions that may be useful to think about. NEH I'm presenting just as a sort of case study and also as my home organization, but a number of federal agencies do support libraries, archives, and museums, as I'm sure that many of you know, including the Institute for Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, which also sponsors ATALM. NSF, as I mentioned, the Documenting Endangered Language Program is collaboration between NEH and NSF and the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian. There are also other non-federal organizations that one might think about, including the Hidden Collections Program run by the Council on Library and Information Resources. And there are, of course, the Breath of Life Institutes. And also I would point toward universities and tribal colleges as institutions that may employ people who work with collections and may have expertise to share. We try to encourage collaboration in many of the NEH grant programs, and tomorrow we're also going to be talking about NEH programs for educational initiatives, in particular at tribal colleges and universities. And some of those have supported work with language materials at TALMs. So that concludes my short overview, and I think that we'll hold off on questions and let the other two presenters, and then we'll take some time for questions at the end. So thanks very much. Next is Brian Carpenter.
So I want to thank Jesse and NEH and other folks for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to all of you here. I'm going to give a perspective on a finished audio project that we did over 6 years. I'm going to be skipping over a lot of the more technical details of how we did it in the middle of things and kind of take a look backwards from having finished the project, some things we came to understand about the collections, how they're used, their significance, and hopefully provide some observations that may be useful to you if you're engaging in doing your own digitization project, or if you run a community library, archive, museum, and are interested in obtaining audio material from institutions like APS or other ones. So one thing I want to start out with usually is the name American Philosophical Society is not familiar to everybody. It sounds like we're a society for philosophers in America, these guys, right? So the question arises, why do a bunch of philosophers have materials from Native communities? This is a question I wondered before I worked there. Well, to explain, the APS was founded in the mid-1700s by Benjamin Franklin and his various gentlemen amateur scientist friends in Philadelphia. They wanted to have a sort of scientific society where they could exchange ideas. In that period of time, what we now call the natural sciences, they refer to as natural philosophy. So that's the philosophy in the title. A lot of the people who were involved at the APS early on were interested in lots of various things. One of them, a key influence in the APS's history, was Thomas Jefferson, who was the president of the APS before, during, and after he was president of the United States. Jefferson's influence in the APS was in part that he, one thing he was interested in doing was trying to understand how native languages worked. And so he sent out these word lists to everyone he could think of who would have contact with Indians, and got these word lists back and did comparative vocabularies to try to see if were there affinities between languages, the assumption there would be affinities between history, common alliances, and so forth. Now, let it not go unmentioned that his interest in this was not purely scientific, it was also political, and a lot of what he used was for expanding settlers and was not good for Native people, obviously. And the assumption he had was that this was going to be preserved because these languages were going to go away. They even assumed that back in his day. Skipping ahead about 100 years later, another big influence was Franz Boas, who may be a familiar name. To put it briefly, for the context here, he established sort of very dominant models for how to transcribe and record Native American languages. He wanted to understand how Native cultures describe themselves in their own terms, not in relation to something else. But again, even in Boas's era and his students and their students, the idea was that you got to do this because the languages are going away and we got to preserve it and steady it. So Boas, he deposited his papers at the APS around the 40s, along with the fieldwork of all of his colleagues, their students, etc. So what has resulted is that now the APS is the oldest and among the larger institutions in the United States collecting that has Native American languages and also historical material as well. So as a result of all this, we found ourselves over the years, audio recordings started coming in, along with all the manuscripts too. They started coming in about the 1930s and sort of picked up after over the decades after that. So all sorts of formats, you name them, we got them pretty much, and they all present their own challenges. And we knew that they were there, but there was a general sense that they're being heavily underused. So in 2007, the librarians started to think, well, gosh, we got to do something about this. We got to make it more well-known and preserve the material. So we got a funding from the W. Mellon Foundation. It's a project a lot similar to very similar to the ones that Jesse just described, to digitize and catalog the entirety of the collections. Now, there were some things that we assumed about the collections when we started. We had some general ideas about what was there, but it turned out that this changed over time. So fast forward 6 years, a lot of cataloging, a lot of digging around in manuscripts to find out what matches up with these recordings, a lot of listening. I wore out a couple pairs of headphones. What we discovered at the end was we didn't have 2,000 hours, we had more like 3,100 hours. We didn't have 125 languages, had 162, and there were a lot more audio collections containing material that weren't even described in our existing catalog. The real benefit of having all this time to catalog these collections was that we were able to catalog it down to the item level. So what we did is, whereas before we had descriptions of like, there's this set of tapes, there's this many of them, this is the kind of stuff on it, we could say, here are all the songs, all the stories, all the interviews. So we have over 9,000 different individual records, and this allows people to really understand what's in the material and find things like information about speakers, names of people, locations, all this other much richer information that we assumed that putting this information out there would increase usage of the material, and that indeed happened. So one question that occurs is, how could you not know, how could you have these sort of very wrong estimates earlier on? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One is there's a lot of, when you go to look at audio material, it's hard to just look at it and know what it is. You got to listen to it, right? And there's a lot of differences in amount between all these collections. Some people who recorded the material were very meticulous and wrote down very nice, detailed descriptions of everything you'd want to know. This is a cataloger's dream, really helpful. However, even with stuff like this, it turns out sometimes you'll listen to these and you'll find out that there's other stuff on here that they forgot to write down, because maybe they typed this up months later. then there are other collections where you don't really have anything to work with at all. So I know that this is Frank Siebert, and he mainly worked with the Penobscot language, Penobscot community. So when I listen to the tape and it just starts in someone talking in a not an English language, I assumed it's Penobscot, but didn't have anything else to go on. So it was hard to, there's lots of the collections are somewhere in between these two extremes. The other difficulty is it's hard to know when you have audio tapes how much length it is, especially with some formats like reel-to-reel tapes. So, part of it is you look at a tape, you don't know how much of it is actually filled up. Like you could have a 45-minute cassette tape, maybe they only recorded 20 minutes. Maybe that cassette tape you have is actually a duplicate of one you already digitized. So, for example, on these two tapes, the one on the left here, there was about 15 minutes of audio. The one on the right, there was 7.5 hours of material. So this stretched out over the entire collections. The numbers change quite a bit. And it's really beneficial. You get to learn a lot of new things, but the process of discovery is quite surprising. Sometimes past catalogers have looked at the material and sort of tried to save you some time. I wish there was more of this, but there's all sorts of interesting legacy information that's around, but you really have to just listen to the stuff. That'll tell you what it is, and it's really exciting to figure out what's there. And every set of tapes is different. The sort of the habits of the person who collected it, who recorded it, how they documented it. Everyone's, we're all different in how well we write things down and in what way. So my experience is just anecdotal, but I would say if you're going to do an audio project, you're probably going to discover things you didn't realize you had, and that's going to be very interesting. So at the end of the day, when we finished the project, we didn't really understand at the start where everything came from. So what I started doing was, of the 162 languages, tried to say, what are the actual speaking communities that these came from? So some languages have lots of different speaking communities. I stopped at about 200. This is most of them, but this really made us understand where our materials were from. We had this idea that we didn't, for example, have much material of indigenous languages of Mexico. That definitely proved not to be the case. There was an understanding that there's stuff from some South American languages, so on. But the more one listens to these recordings, there's more, and gets to know even individual ones, there's a really powerful understanding that there's stories behind every single one of these dots, and people with knowledge in all of these places who know a heck of a lot more about what it means, what it is, its significance, than someone like I ever would. So to give you an example of how the audio is sort of findable and accessible now, this is an example of, in the past, what a collection description would look like. Very simple, 8 reels of tape, songs, texts, and folklore. So the information was there, we cataloged it, we said, hey, it's over here, but this was really never used. So one of the reasons for severe underuse was sort of insufficient information. And how it is now, so we still have the collection level description, but now it's informed by the actual contents of the tapes. So when you come to our library catalog, if you go to our library page, there's a collections search. I invite you to do this if you're interested later, and you can type in what you're searching for. A lot of results will come in. The recordings are within the manuscript collections. That's just a place we put them. So you'll have your search results of a finding aid, or indicating where a finding aid is, some summary level information. Then you can click on the finding aid, or up on this part here. This will take you to the actual finding aid itself. Here again, you have that same summary level information we saw on that sort of printed thing earlier, but it's a lot more detailed. But what's really important here is there's this detailed inventory section. This is where we can say everything that's on the tapes. So just scrolling down a bit, I'm sorry that if this is hard to see in the back, but what we're seeing here is, it says like 3, 4. This is the third tape and the fourth thing on that tape. Then you have the names of everyone who was involved in creating it. That includes, yes, the anthropologist or whoever it was, but also all the speakers, singers, people who were there that we know about, and all sorts of other information you might want to know of it. And here you can click on the this item has been digitized link. This then takes you to the place in our digital library where the actual recording is. Now, we have this in our digital library. It's accessible by a login and password, and we can set people up to do that with those. And it's established we give access to them on a collection-by-collection basis, rather than across the board. The main idea of that is there are sometimes collections that we come to understand have material that is private or sacred or et cetera, and this allows us to administer that access in a more appropriate way from consulting with the communities and coming to understand that. So you log in and you can listen to the streaming audio, or you can download an MP3, and then you have the full information on the recording here. It's a lot of information. In some cases, it's a little too much, frankly, because not all of this is stuff that people are going to use for searching. But some of it is really valuable. So, for example, there's often people who write, say, I saw you have this recording. That's my auntie who sang that song. I'd like to find anything else that she sang. Well, you can say Kate Sanford. You can type that in and find all the ones that have her as the singer, whether it's in this collection or in a lot of collections. So you can search across the collections too, not just one at a time. So one thing we wanted to track was, the idea was, right, if you catalog it, they will come. People will use it if it's more up there. My stats aren't very good, the early part of the project, but in the beginning, the first years of the 2000s, like leading up to the start of the project, the guy who was doing the reproduction orders, he told me we had maybe 2 or 3 copy requests per year. One of the reasons was because of that inaccessibility. Another one was the expense. It was charged per hour, how many hours of tape. Now these recordings are for free. That's important to know. That also helped increase access. So these are noting communities to which material was sent. Some of these are places who have a tribal archive, library, or museum. Some are just individual people who are writing and say, I'm from this community, I'm studying my language, do you have some tapes about that? The lighter dots are ones that did not involve audio. So this is the 2010, and then adding on 2011, over the years, it increased more and more. Some of these were pretty much all just people getting in touch with us through word of mouth. As we cataloged more things gained visibility. So, and then what we tried to do is actually also, as much as possible, follow up with people saying, how is this material useful to you? What are ways you're using it? Is there a way we could describe it better that it would make more sense? Not how the anthropologist or linguist thought about it, but how you would like to use it. And we discovered a lot of things from that. Now, what I want to pull back here is to take away all the audio-related requests. We came to understand that the audio was the main way that people were accessing indigenous collections at the library, period, and that the main constituencies of the library of these materials were Native people. It took the APS 200 years to just simply realize that Native people were a constituency of the library, which was a big, important step. But then the further realization had to be that not just that they're the main constituency for this area of the material. It's kind of an obvious thing in retrospect, but it took a while to get it, So one thing we've been trying to follow up on is just getting materials to someone is good, but the idea is how is it used is more, what are ways we can make that more, what happens after that? So one thing I realized was that especially in cases where we're getting large amounts of material to a tribal archive or library is to it makes sense to the way we have it set up now is you can download an MP3 and then you have to hand title every single one. When you have sometimes hundreds of individual recordings, this is very tedious and it's hard to make good record keeping for the person downloading it. So even though it's accessible online, it still in some cases makes sense for us to do the old thing of putting it on a CD, saying, what's a better way for you to have this? And giving more accompanying documentation supplemental to this. We're still doing this, but just to not do a data dump, so to speak, not say, here's all the copies, see you later. It's the more we follow up and learn from people using the material who understand it, we can then subsequently help address common questions for other collections. The other thing about use is we came to realize that not all of this material, just talking about language material alone, it doesn't always lend itself immediately to usage in language teaching curriculum. Some really very much do, like I found this collection of Wallapai language material, and in the manuscripts there were these instructional books for children or beginning learners, and the way it had been described in the past gave no picture of the fact that this was instructional material. But not everything, if you're learning language and you have a 10-minute story of a fluent speaker, it's very inspiring, it's very useful, but it's hard to just say, listen to this and learn. So people trying to learn more about how people teaching the language can sort of find ways to use the material transform archival material into curriculum. And there's a lot of thoughts about that. We're also needing to get the help of the communities of origin and just understanding what some of the stuff is. There's lots of untranslated material. We're trying to identify that and sort of work and do collaborative partnerships to understand what it is so we can tell them that it's there, and also for us to be able to represent it accurately. Sometimes I find things that I can't read. I'd hoped that this would tell me a little bit, and this is a tape where someone had just, you play it and someone's just talking, and I had no idea what it was. I was hoping that this would tell me what the contents were, but it turns out one of them says, try recording this again, and the other one says, runs a little fast. From speaking with a lady from one of the communities. Just as a couple of final things, one thing we've been doing is taking recordings back to the communities and saying, tell us more about what's significant here. One thing we had was these SoundScriber discs from the 40s of a lady named Molly Sequoia from the Eastern Band Cherokee, who had come up to Philadelphia and done these recordings with the linguist. They sat on a shelf basically for 60 years, untouched and unlistened to. The Eastern Band is one of our partners who we work with, and we went back one time. We were bringing some other CDs of audio and said, "Oh, we have these recordings of Molly Sequoia." And Myrtle, the driver on the right, she said, "Oh, well, I know Molly Sequoia's daughter. She just lives up the way." And so she said, "Would you like her to come here tomorrow?" And so she came, and then we played the recordings for Amanda Swimmer, her daughter. She didn't even know that her mom had gone to Philadelphia back then to do that. And then they very graciously allowed us to record them, listening to it and talking about it. We would play a section, they would talk about it in Cherokee. Once in a while, they'd say something English just to let us know a little bit about it. But the idea of the recording was also that we will record it. It'll be part of the archive, but we're turning it to the school so that they can use it in their immersion program for these kids. So we're able to record it and return it as well. And final thing, in 1948, this guy, Tony Wallace, went to Tuscarora Nation and made a lot of recordings, including with the guy in the far right, Chief Clinton Rickard. And the Tuscarora were one of our ongoing partnerships. And in these, here again, the stories, a a lot of the people we worked there were language teachers, third grade teachers, for example. One of the granddaughter of Chief Clinton Rickard took recordings that he had made telling stories of the area, history, took them back to and used them in her third grade classroom. And the kids wrote some notes reflecting upon it. And just here, what I wanted to highlight here is that what she says at the end is like, now I can tell the story again. So it's something that was recorded under the idea that this information is going away, but it was only just housed on these tapes for a brief period, and now the story is returning to the oral tradition. So there's a lot of other variations of these kinds of stories, but I'm gone over time, and thanks for your kind attention.
And our final presenter on this first part of the session is Pam Wintle from the National Anthropological Archives, Human Studies Film Archives.
I've never done a PowerPoint before, so I'm just curious what it looks like. I'm also switching hands here from where I've rehearsed this presentation. So, okay, thank you, Jesse, for this, the panel, organizing the panel, and the opportunity to speak. And thank you all for coming to DC and attending the session on such a glorious day. Behind this unremarkable entrance to the Smithsonian's Museum Support Center, a research and collection storage facility in Suitland, Maryland, are more unremarkable doors. But behind these doors are the remarkable archival collections of the National Anthropological Archives and the Human Studies Film Archives. These sister archives are located in the Department of Anthropology in the National Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian Institution, a relatively short walking distance from this hotel. I'm the senior film archivist for the Film Archives. The NAA collections are primarily manuscripts, still photographs, and sound recordings. Because the NAA grew out of the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnography, created in 1879, the collection is particularly strong in American Indian documentation. HSFA turned 40 only this year. The collections are primarily film and video, but also still photographs and sound recordings and paper records that relate to and support the moving images. The HSFA holds a range of tantalizing moving images of American Indians dating back as early as 1907. The NAA and HSFA strive to make these materials available to communities, researchers, students, filmmakers, and the general public. However, for the AV materials, access is defined by agreements, copyright, availability of reference copies, and viewing and listening equipment. Film is particularly problematical from both a technical and rights perspective. This is a bonus photo showing just how far we've come. Online appointments can be scheduled through the NAA and HSFA website. Collection discovery is primarily through the Smithsonian's online cataloging database, SIRIS, or Smithsonian Institution Research Information System. From this homepage, one can search the archival records across many Smithsonian collections. In this example, I searched on Sioux and limited the search to the HSFA. Several records appeared, and I then clicked on one to see the full catalog record, as you can see by the below image. Some of the HSFA records are accompanied by video clips. As a side note, the NAA updated its catalog records with consistent ethnonyms of American Indian tribal names. The HSFA will also be undertaking updating its catalog records to conform to NAA's records. Over the years, it has become clearer and more apparent that these archival records live only through engagement with the communities who generously informed, willingly or unwillingly, the creation of these records. Following are some past examples and aspirations for what could be. John Peabody Harrington's ethnographic and linguistic research is the crown jewel in the National Anthropological Archives. Obsessive in his amassing of research data, Harrington's collection documents over 130 languages and contains well over 400,000 pages of manuscripts, over 200 sound recordings, 3,500 photographs, thousands of botanical and other natural specimens, and 600 artifacts. Geographically, he worked in California, the Southwest, Great Plains, Alaska, southern Mexico, across much of Canada, and the eastern coast of the United States. The collection has always been used by researchers such as linguists, ethnobotanists, cultural anthropologists, and Native American scholars. But under the current Arcadia Foundation funded digitization project, online accessibility will expand the audience. To date, all of the late 1970s microfilm of the manuscript materials has been digitized and is now online. Currently, the aluminum discs are being digitized, and some are already online. As part of this project, other linguistic sound recordings are also being digitized for online access, and when the grant is completed, over 1,800 sound recordings will be accessible. We are committed to an open access policy with no restrictions, except if a request is initiated by a community concerned with cultural sensitivity and/or intellectual property issues. In these cases, the sound recordings will be removed. As part of the current digitizing project, we are making efforts to notify communities of newly posted materials to encourage listening to the sound recordings as soon as possible and providing feedback on potential questionable materials. NAA's linguistic manuscripts and sound recordings have also been a centerpiece for the National Breath of Life Archival Language Institute, which provides research assistance in historical, genealogical, and photograph collections, as well as the artifact collections. The third institute, jointly hosted by the National Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of the American Indian, and the Library of Congress, was this past summer. Some community engagement projects create media that then become part of the HSFA collections. Media is now commonly used to document and enhance historical materials. And because of the ephemeral nature of contemporary media, it must be intentionally archived so that it too will survive as an essential part of the historical record. Two projects were the NAA's Winter Count Artworks website and the Arctic Studies Center's Sharing Knowledge Project, which was conducted with community scholars in preparing for the Anchorage Museum's Living Our Cultures, Sharing Our Heritage, the First Peoples of Alaska exhibit. In 1993, HSFA acquired the Father Bernard R. Hubbard Film Collection from Santa Clara University, where Hubbard had been a teacher and a researcher. Part of this collection consists of 40,000 feet or 20 hours of film that he shot in the winter of 1937-38 in King Island, Alaska. At this time, Deanna Kingston, a descendant of a King Islander, and an anthropology graduate student came to the HSFA to work with this collection. With the help of HSFA and the Department of Anthropology's Arctic Studies Center, Deanna received a National Science Foundation grant for an oral history project with the King Island community using the Hubbard film footage. In a chapter that Deanna wrote for the book, Museums and Source Communities, she relates her discoveries upon screening the Hubbard footage for 3 different audiences: herself, her uncle Alex Matoyak, and King Island elders. She observed from her experience that photographs and film are not static objects that have only one interpretation. Rather, the viewer's experience imbue images with multiple interpretations. Because she had been separated from the community as a young person, she was intrigued to know more about what was happening in the film. Having lived outside Alaska for over 30 years, Her uncle was aware of the interest in the activities depicted, but he was also concerned in explaining who the people were and their relationships to each other. The elders tended to ignore the activities and focused on identification of kin and namesake relationships. From Deanna's chapter. Their reactions showed that the King Island elders are much more interested in seeing themselves and their relatives and namesakes who are no longer alive. I believe this reflects the fact that activities they see in the film are just normal, everyday activities, very much like driving a car or eating cereal are for me. In other words, they will figure out how one is related to themselves, even if the connecting close relationship is 3 or 4 generations in the past. So the elders, when viewing the film and seeing themselves and other deceased relatives, concentrated on reporting the intricate kinship and naming relationships because it was traditionally important to do so, and they want this information to be recorded for future generations. I apologize for, there was that cursor, for not being able to, a better clip of Alex Matoyak's annotation that he made with Deanna as part of the oral history project. In this case, he was, and that cursor keeps disappearing. There we go. He was viewing a video copy, which he stopped when he wanted to say more than there was time for, and that cursor just keeps disappearing. No. Okay. There we go.
There's an open lead just beyond the shore ice. We called the moving ice Sigu and the shore ice Tuak. At times, this ice pack can be moving quite rapidly. At other times, it is stationary.
All the audiovisual materials for Deanna that were created for Deanna's oral history project are also in the HSFA collections. Some of our community engagements are serendipitous, and this most recent initiative points to challenges when the materials are restricted by donors, external agreements, and/or copyright. In this most recent instance, a researcher discovered through CIRRUS that the HSFA has a German collection, Institut für den Wissenschaften, and forgive my German, Films Encyclopedia Cinematographica of ethnographic films that includes 1964 films of the Wara, an indigenous group in Brazil. The agreement with the IWF is highly restrictive due to their agreements with German anthropologists who shot the films and German copyright. Our hands are tied, but we stuck out our necks and permitted the researcher to photograph key frames of the film for her to take back to Wara elders for identification. On screen is an email response from one of her younger informants after seeing one of the screenshots. While we felt that we could not take the risk of providing the moving images without permission from the donor, we felt that the age of her elder informants and the value of the information that would be shared with the HSFA and all future researchers outweighed the risk. As a final note on challenges, the IWF is now defunct, and the original film is archived at the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, but the commercial rights are held by a separate German entity. We've provided this information to the researcher who hopes to obtain future use of the moving images. The HSFA is also a clearinghouse for information on other repositories holding moving images and on issues of preservation and access. In my experience, moving images of American Indians are scattered throughout different repositories across the United States. Some of the most interesting and seemingly rich films were taken by amateur filmmakers who had access based on relationships within the tribe. I am on the advisory board for the University of Arizona's American Indian Film Gallery, and I would be remiss if I did not point out what I think is an exciting and innovative project. The AIFG's collection is primarily old educational films with narrations that one could generously describe as outdated. But these are valuable visual documents. The AIFG is now seeking grants to support documenting the films and creating new alternative narrations to reframe the moving images. Jennifer Jenkins, one of the lead academics, calls this tribal sourcing. Finally, I will wrap up by pointing out the network of other Smithsonian resources supporting community engagement. The Smithsonian's Office of Fellowships and Internships oversees various sponsored internships, including the Native American Internship Award and the National Museum of the American Indian Internship. Fellowships include the Native American Community Scholars Award, Native American Visiting Student Awards, and Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. In the Department of Anthropology are Recovering Voices, the Endangered Language Program, Arctic Studies Center, located both in D.C. and Anchorage, and the Repatriation Office, a program that works with Native peoples to repatriate or find alternative care solutions for collection objects and specimens. Additionally, the National Museum of the American Indian and the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage actively engage with Native communities. Okay, so now it's time to take out your cell phone and take a snapshot. You're actually taking me up on it. Okay. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, again. We're at 3:45, so I think we'll get started on the second half of the audiovisual double panel that we've put together here. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce these next two colleagues, and they're really carrying a lot of weight on the panel because we've kind of pushed things around a little bit due to some panelist changes and everything. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about nuts and bolts and project planning and implementation of projects. I will introduce them both, and then they're going to take up the second half of the session, and we'll have another time for questions at the end. So the presenters on the second part are first Guha Shankar, Folklife Specialist in the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. At the center, he's the director of the National Civil Rights History Project. His other responsibilities involve multimedia production, developing standards for digital media creation and preservation, developing public programs for educational outreach, and teaching cultural documentation methods for academic and community-based initiatives. His research interests and publications include issues and challenges in indigenous, tangible, intangible cultural heritage, diasporic community formations in the Caribbean, ethnographic media, visual representation, and performance studies. He holds a PhD from UT Austin, which he received in 2003 from the Department of Anthropology with the concentration in folklore and public culture, and a BA in radio, television, and motion pictures in political science from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And our second presenter in this part is Maggie Kruesi. She's a folklorist and cataloger at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, where she creates metadata for audiovisual collections and digital projects, including the Center's Civil Rights History Project. She received her doctorate in folklore and folk life at the University of Pennsylvania in 1995 and worked at the University of Pennsylvania Rare Book and Manuscript Library as a manuscripts cataloger before coming to the American Folklife Center in 2004. So I'll give it over to Guha.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you all for being here. And because I care, I'm going to start my stopwatch, just so I know that I'm within time. Great tools. So the panel presentation that you're about to see is quite a bit different from the previous one, in that Maggie and I are going to be following on what our colleagues Brian Carpenter and Pam Wintle did speaking specifically about case studies. We're going to be talking a bit more generally about tools and methods and initiatives and resources that we've developed and continue to develop at the Library of Congress to help people with a range of collections materials. Maggie's talk and mine are somewhat disjunct in that she's focusing on really interesting stuff, like describing, cataloging, and getting all that juicy metadata about collections sensibly and logically organized, the kind of work that she does on a daily basis, kind of work that our other colleague, Kathy Kirst, also does, and how we organize them so that you, our patrons, can find our materials on the reading room or, as is now the case, the virtual reading room called the World Wide Web. And while she'll be talking about these tools, ways to provide tools for uncovering and putting your hands on collections of all kinds, whether it's the legacy collection that's been sitting around your archive for 100 years or so, to the born digital stuff that you're doing. What I want to talk about a bit more is what you might want to consider when you undertake or start planning a documentary project that, when it is complete, will result in collections materials. So I'm focused on sort of the 21st century version of generating collections. I guess I should engage here in a bit of a paid political party announcement and say that we both work at the American Folklife Center, as Jesse has mentioned. We work at the Library of Congress, which, as our esteemed leader, Dr. James Billington, likes to say, is the United States' oldest federal cultural heritage agency. I haven't quite always wrapped my head around that, but I think that's true because he said so. We at the center have the world's largest, we would claim, ethnographic archive. It's a multi-format archive which, as both Brian and Pam have mentioned in their own materials, contains a variety of materials ranging from manuscripts, which are the field notes, the documentary work of ethnographers, of amateurs, to use that word advisedly, to audiovisual materials, which is the primary focus of our collecting efforts at the American Folklife Center. So audio recordings, we have the the country's oldest audio recording, the recordings of Jesse Walter Fuchs. In 1890, he recorded Passamaquoddy Indian people in Calais, Maine. And oddly enough, as is sometimes the case in these endeavors, the papers of Jesse Walter Fuchs are at the National Anthropological Archives. So if you were to come do research at our archives on those kinds of materials, you would have to make sure that you were in shape for a long walk out to Sweetland, Maryland, to consult the collections. Now, with regard to what I'm going to be talking about, I want to distinguish between two broad kinds of documentation, that people may engage in. On the one hand, folks document cultural expressions like foodways, dance and music. They document traditional culture bearers. That is to say, they conduct oral history interviews with elders in indigenous communities. But their interest, for one reason or the other, begins and ends with the documentary event or the documentary product, like a podcast or a newspaper article that comes out of that encounter. They're agnostic, which I think is a polite way of saying they don't really care all that much about what happens to the documentary materials after they produce their product or blog or essay or what have you. By contrast, I'm going to presume, until proven wrong, that those of you in this room are thinking and worrying about documentation as a process. And it's a process that will require you to pay attention to everything from the conception of the project to the long-term sustainability of the documentary materials. So what I'm going to go do in my part of the presentation is to go through resources and guidelines that we've developed at the library, either amongst ourselves, that is to say staff at the library, or in conjunction with other colleagues elsewhere in the world of ethnographic documentation, who we work with in developing some of these resources and tools. And in some cases, I will be the first to admit, I unashamedly use their materials wholesale when I'm teaching field projects and cultural documentation, because they're just that good. And they speak to a way in which we all share certain kinds of aspirations about producing documentary materials that are going to be sustainable for the future. And what I'm also going to talk to you about today is I'm going to narrowly focus on the production of what you might want to consider when you're doing oral history interviews or oral narratives with members of your community or anywhere else for that matter. I do that not only because of the time constraints, because if we started going into the world of documentary production in a writ large, then we'd be here all day. But it is the case that having come to ATALM over the course of the past 8 years or so, in this gathering, there is great and growing emphasis on documenting and using instances of spoken word and oral narrative, oral histories, for projects that people in Native communities do in terms of language revitalization, cultural revival, animating historical memory, using those kinds of first-person recordings and the words of members of their community for a range of these projects. So over the course of the Center's existence, I will say that we've gained a fair bit of experience in conducting field documentation and producing documentary materials, given our academic training in folklore at the Music College and Anthropology. What I do at the Center, just by way of telling you where I'm coming from, I'm part of a team that provides interested individuals, as Jesse had mentioned earlier in his introduction, whether they're members of academic circles, as to say college students, or members of indigenous communities, with training in documentary methods through these intensive field schools that we conduct. And Maggie has been part of that experience for some time now, also along with myself and a couple of others from the Center. So the slide that you see behind me is one of the very first sites that we point to or we use in our documentary field schools. And this was essentially a site developed as a result of a request that was made to us from the World Intellectual Property Organization. Sometime in 2010, we worked with the Maasai community, an indigenous group in East Africa, the Maasai of Laikipia, to provide them documentary training because they had some of the same interests which is increasingly and has been on the minds and sort of aims of indigenous communities, Indian communities here in this country, which is to take control of their own representations, both through self-documentation, but through curation, through having control of these materials in a way that non-native or non-indigenous repositories, in some ways to back away from that old model, the old colonial model of outsiders came, as Brian mentioned earlier, they documented it, then they took it back to their home institutions, never to be heard from or seen again in those communities from the sources of origin for those materials. So this was one response to that, was to come up with these documentary guidelines. And you will see here, for instance, on the left, what we've done is there's a checklist of materials that we say are really sort of crucial when people are undertaking documentary projects. And so we have, for instance, things like ethics statements, how to conduct research and open view of the community. Ethnography, as we understand it, is documentation and full view of the community. Sort of a contrast to the days of yore when anthropologists would come and would get sacred songs from Indian people by getting certain elders with whom they were friendly or whom they could coax into revealing sort of esoteric and sacred secrets. And repositories of any size, I would say, around the world have some of those materials, those restricted materials which Brian had mentioned, which ought not to have been recorded, but which are out there nevertheless. So ethnographic process these days is about full consent, full documenting with full permission of the particular host community with whom we work. And the notion of ethics, of course, cuts across not just the treatment of outsiders with regard to people who are members of a particular cultural community, but how do people within that community themselves, what are their sort of protocols and social rules for engaging elders, for instance. Those are all kinds of the issues that we're trying to deal with. We pitch it at the level of the university students, but the whole point of ethics, as I said, cuts across both inside and outside sort of divisions. We do have some materials also in terms of intellectual property rules. Intellectual property and intangible cultural heritage are, again, contested territories or contested areas for indigenous communities. There is a great feeling on the part of people that the notion of appropriation of cultural materials is going on, and it hasn't stopped in the recent age. The digital domain and the digital means of recording are great opportunities on the one hand for people to record themselves, to represent their traditions. It also is, inarguably, the fact that it's also easier to reproduce on scale, which was not previously known when you had analog recordings like reel-to-reels. In point of fact, I would say that within archival institutions, the very fact that some material has been recorded on material on media which is obsolescent might actually make them a little bit more secure than, say, the digital domain, which allows for an infinite number of copies with not a whole lot of effort other than just a click of a button. And these are concerns, I think, for those of us who work in archives and libraries, and how to prevent unauthorized copying of these materials, particularly when it comes to sensibilities on the part of cultural communities who don't want certain materials out there in public view. So there's some interesting issues that come up around intellectual property that we also try and make available as part of our teaching toolkit. And then there are, of course, much more gut bucket issues. I'm not going to delve into it, but interviewing guides. We provide people templates for how to engage in what we call careful listening. An interview, in our view, and this is something which Melinda Maynard Lowry said last night, who's a director for the Center for the Oral History Program at UNC Chapel. She said, an interview or an ethnographic encounter or an oral history is not just about asking questions, it's about careful listening. So these are part of the guidelines and the templates we emphasize to people like yourself who may be wanting to undertake documentary projects or oral history interviews. Maybe you should ask for a show of hands, and perhaps I'm preaching to the choir and you've already embarked on it. How many of you have done oral history projects out there? And all of you. All right, so I am preaching to the choir, but whatever. Thank you for that. Thanks for affirming my faith in this presentation. The other thing that I do want to concentrate on, and this is the one of the things I think is most important in this process, is the project planning template. And what the project planning template does, and we've used this to great success over the course of the last 15 to 20 years in our field schools, and it's applicable, I think, in a range of different circumstances. But it asks you to go through a checklist of why you want to do a project, a documentary project specifically, but it has wider applications, ramifications, as I'll just mention in a second. What it says is go through a checklist that asks you to build an elephant with your eyes wide open, rather than trying to engage in the example of the blind man whose description of an elephant was grossly partial and lacking essential information because they just didn't understand the whole picture. And so what we're trying to do is ask you in this project planning template to take a survey of the landscape into which you're venturing. And this has ramifications for the preservation landscape which you'll enter when you undertake such initiatives. The point of the project template is to raise some red flags, and I use the term advisedly. When I say red flags, I don't mean that should stop you in your tracks, but we're asking you to temper your enthusiasm and your optimism of capturing some portion of cultural memory, of your intangible cultural heritage, of your community traditions, with some cautions, so that you can plan for it in a way that it's going to be sustainable. We want you to have a pragmatic reckoning of what you'll be facing in terms of the challenges and needs for support at all levels, from preservation to IT infrastructure, to personnel, the ways to manage your collections objects, and many more aspects of the documentary process. So one of the very first questions, as you can see here, is we ask you to do a budget, or we ask you to say, how much money do you have on hand to do anything? We ask that you think about the goals of your project. Goals change over the course of time. The goals change over the course of the particular initiative that you're embarking in. You may have thought that all you wanted to do was to do a blog, do like a website, then gradually it morphs into something like a blog, and then people say, well, what about social media? And all of those questions, if you build them in at the front end of the project to the extent possible, then it just makes it a little bit easier not to have to make a great conceptual leap from doing something which you thought was just going to be like a website, and then all of a sudden you're going to have to figure out resources in order to do social media, in order to do blog posts, in order to do streaming audio or streaming video, those kinds of things. And Obviously, there are, and let me just get out of this for just a quick second because I wanted to show you this in the particular aspect of it. In terms of preservation and this particular panel, what I'm most interested in here is asking you to think about how do you plan on sustaining the materials that you're going to generate. So the very first question that I often ask when people call on the phone is, what is your IT infrastructure? People say they want to do an oral history project. That's the first question I ask. Not necessarily do you have training in it or how to do documentation, but where will you actually house the materials? How do you know that the materials you have are going to be safe in the digital environment? If you're an institution of small or large size, what is your relationship with your IT department? Does your IT department understand ethnographic materials? Does your IT department understand the need for you to have access? And do they understand the formats you'll be bringing in? I mean, that's one thing. It's not the case that every library and every archives, perhaps, that libraries are not necessarily equipped to handle the large volume and the large sizes of particular file formats that you might be generating through your documentary projects. All of those we ask that you consider at the head end of the project. The most difficult thing to do is to change horses in midstream and try to do something, because what's going to happen is if you embark upon a documentation project, you get all the way into it, you are fully invested in doing an oral history interview, and then you say, where am I going to put this stuff? You can't put it in your computer. That's inadvisable for a lot of reasons. I mean, just to be, you don't want digital assets which are going to be unique documentary materials in the same computer that you use for your, kids, Nintendo games or whatever else kids play these days on computers. I don't have any kids, so I really wouldn't know. But I assume that they're doing something on computers which should not be done in the same environment as your precious digital assets. Do you have the infrastructure that supports that? Do you have people in place that you can call upon to help you, store these materials and retrieve them when necessary? The corollary reason to do this kind of planning project circles back into what Jesse's framing presentation was talking about, which was you will want to, or you may already have, access to funding agencies and funding plans and funding awards and so on that may give you money in order to carry out these initiatives. In that regard, what we see this as being useful is to colleagues who, if they were to research and assign real-world dollar amounts to various phases of the project, it'll enable them to present real-world needs to external funding agencies and also funding sources within your organization or tribal entity. Your tribal government may want to see the need why you want to have an archive and may want to really ask you to dig down deep and say, what are the parameters and what are the actual preservation needs? What is my infrastructure need? How do I upgrade the servers in the archives and the libraries and so on? This is a conversation I've been having with colleagues of mine at one of the southwestern tribes, trying to work on a planning grant over the course of 3 years, which is going to get them money to basically revamp their entire digital infrastructure in their local library. So these are the reasons we ask in order to think about how to do the project planning. Sorry, I'm running up against time here. So let me just move on to the other thing that I wanted to mention here, and that is, sorry, not quite sure what's happened here. Sorry. So the other set of resources that we have on the site, we guide you to places that can actually talk to you in very nice and very easy detail as to how to procure digital audio recorders if you're doing an oral history project. This is our colleague Doug Boyd site at the University of Kentucky Library. So you see the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History. One of the things we often get is, what equipment should I use? What Doug has done over the course of the years talking to colleagues is to put together this very nice matrix, which is essentially radio buttons where you can come in, and say, I have this much money on hand in order to get a recorder. What kind of recorder should I get? That's always one question which gets asked. By plugging in just a series of parameters that you want to use in terms of budget, in terms of miking requirements, for instance, in terms of the recording formats, it'll enable you to come up with, this tool enables you to come up with a list of appropriate documentation equipment. Again, you see the URL right up there on the right. I'm happy to email this to you if you like. This is the other thing which I really emphasize when asking people about documentary projects or documentation research is, what is your preservation infrastructure? When you generate documentation, do you have any idea what the costs of digital storage are going to be? And by costs, I mean, how much is it going to tax your storage environment? So here, for instance, is, again, a nice little digital audio calculator. And what we have here are the standard recording parameters for recording oral history interviews in the field. We say that we want to record an hour's worth of interview, standard sort of, you can do 2 hours if you like. The bit depth for the recording is going to be 16 bits. The sample rate is 96 kilohertz, which is the archival standard for preservation quality audio recordings. Here, I want to emphasize also that we're talking about this material is going to give you preservation quality audio files. When you're doing transformation of the analog object, this is the target format which vendors and which archives employ in saying, digitize my reel-to-reels, my cassettes, my whatever, to this format. When you do this, you have got yourself data in a format which is ready to go up on a server, which never has touched a physical carrier. And physical carriers, again, this is a topic for another day, maybe Maggie will touch upon this. Physical carriers are generally, in the archival context, out as a way of recording media. What we want is the data, the bits and the bytes. This kind of recording will give you the bits and the bytes to say that this is ready to go up into a deep storage server. I can use it for a variety of other reasons, including archival, doing streams and so on. One file of that size, you'll notice down there, is 1.3 gigabytes. Multiply that by 40 hours, and you'll, if you're going to do 40 interviews at an hour long each, and you realize you've got 55 gigabytes, which is a gazillion CDs as near as I can make out. So, and CDs, of course, are not archivally sound. Again, in terms of resources, I would point you to this particular one, which is the Federal Agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative. This is the Cadillac standard to a certain extent of target formats and how to transform and record and scan and do other kinds of things which are collections materials. Again, this is down here in the bottom, digitizationguidelines.gov. They present case studies for doing born digital capture of audio objects and video objects. And, whoops, I think I'm going over into the, slopping over into Maggie's domain. And so in any case, these are some of the ways, some of the resources which we have at the library which will enable you to think through and carefully plot and plan a preservation-ready oral history documentation project. And I'm going to turn that over to Maggie very abruptly. Thank you.
This, again, are the goals and questions to ask long-term about your projects. What are your goals for preservation? What's your infrastructure? And then this, added this fourth point, how are you planning to create reusable metadata for your preservation and access? How are people going to be able to discover your collection materials, essentially? So one of the chief things I want to emphasize is that it costs money to create good metadata. You need staff that can do this work. I have to say, after seeing Pam's and Brian's presentations a little earlier, that like my heart was filled with jealousy that their metadata is so beautiful and the case studies they were showing you. I know Sears has its issues, but especially the American Philosophical Society, this project that was funded with this funding from NEH, the funding to do good metadata is really important. Otherwise, you don't have the way to access the collections. I'm going to put my glasses on. All righty, here. So again, we're seeing some audio cylinders here. We could do a really quick summary of what we have at the Library of Congress. indigenous peoples' recordings. We have about between 8,000 and 9,000 audio cylinders that were recorded between 1890, the earliest Jesse Walter Fuchs recording, through the 1940s. People were still using cylinder machines in the field in the early 1940s. And we just recently were able to transfer the cylinders out of the Jefferson Building in the Library of Congress in the cellar there, which, although it is HVAC and all, it was not a stable over the 60 or so years that they've been sitting there environment, and we just transferred them earlier this year to the library's state-of-the-art facility in Culpeper, Virginia, so that they can now be digitally preserved. So we're very excited about that, which means I had the chance to review. For one thing, we got to inventory each cylinder. The photo on the right shows the containers the kind of containers that the cylinders were replaced in, and all of the metadata that was on the old housings had to be transferred to the new housings into the spreadsheets that we used in cataloging. So it's important that you preserve metadata wherever you find it when you are dealing with audiovisual materials. So it gave us the chance to inventory them, and it also gave us a chance to create a collection-level catalog record in the Library of Congress catalog. So these had never, one reason you may not know that much that we have thousands of recordings, thousands of hours of recordings of American Indian materials. We have most of Frances Densmore's original recordings at the Library of Congress that were recorded by the Bureau of American Ethnology, the Smithsonian, earlier in those centuries. The reason the Library of Congress has them is that we had this tradition of being able to do audio preservation. They were able to copy cylinders to disc, and was the early preservation method. And we had a laboratory in the library that did that. So these recordings had been transferred to the National Archives, and then they were transferred in 1948, mostly from the National Archives to the Library of Congress. That's how we acquired them. It's an interesting story. And I will get way over time. So we completed this collection-level cataloging. It's not nearly as detailed as the cataloging that Brian showed you earlier for APS, but it gives just an overview for each group of these cylinder recordings. And so they're more discoverable. And I wanted to just give a case study, since we had some great case studies earlier, about what happens if you do have some metadata versus if you don't have any. And this is, we discovered 5 cylinders in this grouping that had never been transferred before. We don't really know where they came from. This summary is just exactly what was written on 4 scraps of paper inside 4 of the 5 cylinders. I always ask with metadata, we have who, what, when, and where. Here we have who, we have the names of the people who were recorded, and we have what it is on the cylinders, which seems to be songs. So we Googled these names, and we found that there was a entry in a copyright, a volume of copyright for 1913. These are the same names anyway. So the date is 1913. We're not really sure whether these were the recordings or not, but then we also found that the names were attached to photographs. And these photographs are at the Museum of the City of New York. This big top and long time sleep. And then we found more photographs that were related to these names. And here's the photographs of people at an encampment that turns out to be on top of a building in New York City, on top of a hotel, the McAlkeman Hotel in New York City. And so I was getting very excited about this, because all of a sudden, just those little pieces of metadata, those names are revealing all of this information that seems quite unusual. And then there was this photograph in the group. So there was a photograph of these 3 men being recorded again and there in that list that I showed you before, there is an entry for Indians talking into phonograph, for the date in March 1913. As it turned out, there was also a lot of, because so many newspapers have been digitized recently, there were newspaper accounts of this visit of the people to New York City, and so now I know where it was recorded in New York. And just listening to Tim Tingle mention yesterday evening about the effect that the railroads had on indigenous communities in the West, it turns out that the reason that these folks had come to New York City was for the opening of Grand Central Station and the dedication of the Glacier National Park, and that the railroad they had come on a Great Northern Railway car that was specially designed for this promotional event, which essentially was like a tourist fair in New York City. So this is the catalog record. I'm talking about metadata here. I tried to put as much information as I knew about that was related to this New York Travel and Vacation Show held in Grand Central Palace, which I believe was Grand Central Station, in 1913. However, these photographs the cylinders themselves have not been digitized, and we don't know exactly what the quality is or what's on them. For many of the catalog records that I made for the cylinder project, I put notes that said that the related documentation is at the National Anthropological Archives, because that's the actual cylinders have been separated from the documentary material. This is the other side, is when the metadata is separated from an audio carrier, you just cannot discover recordings at all. This is from a tape box. It says band on the back of it, which is sometimes a clue. But for some of our cylinders, we had more than 5 that we were not able to identify anything from the housings to know exactly what they were. So what we did at the library is we prioritized those in groups, and the very first cylinders that are down in Culpeper that are being transferred right now are the ones that were not identified, with the hopes that people will be able to use those and listen to them and get more information from them that way, and be able to put them into the context of the other recordings. Context is really crucially important in metadata too. So the fact that these came to us in groups, will be able to, somebody who's listening to them should be able to figure out where they belong among the other recordings. Another thing about time-based media, if you're doing documentation, is that it is time-based. It requires you to keep track of what your recordings, if it's an oral history project or whatever it is, in sequence. And this is a letter it's this form letter actually that Alan Lomax used to send out to everybody who was making disc recordings for the Library of Congress, how you should name your expedition, how you should number your recordings in the order they were recorded, how you should etch identifiers. The important metadata always involves unique identifiers onto the recording itself. And then in the next page, he goes on and on and on about how you need to gather contextual information. You want people to talk. You don't want just songs. You want people to talk. It's important if you're recording tunings of instruments. You've got to write that down. You need to have drawings of instruments if that's what you're documenting. You need to have comparative recordings from different members of the community. And he also says something here, which of course is really completely unethical, about the informant not knowing that he or she is being recorded. So it's a bad example from that point of view. Here is an example of the metadata on the disc sleeves. This is from the Lomax material. This is how they recorded the initial metadata in the field, was on the disc sleeves. And shortly after those early recordings in the 40s were made, they used WPA workers to type card catalog cards at the track level. It's another kind of metadata. And the other thing about sound recordings is not only do you have to inventory every item in your collection to know what you have for digitization projects, you have to know the sequence in which they were recorded. You also frequently will have a log, a recording log, that documents titles or incidents, especially on longer media. And I'm going to go quickly through some of these slides. As I've said before, contextual material is very important. These are Alan Lomax's field notes from his recordings that he made in Haiti in 1936 and 1937. This is Lomax's method of maintaining his metadata for his photographs. He would take the contact sheets and cut them up and then write around them, write the names and the places, people, as he did his work. Again, who, where, what, and when are the most important things. I'm talking mostly here about descriptive metadata, but the technical metadata that's captured by your recording devices is essential, and it's important to know what that is. And administrative metadata is necessary to manage your collections and repositories. The standards, metadata standards, enable sharing of information, and so we generally, when we teach the field school, what we recommend is using Dublin Core because it's relatively simple and straightforward, and but you really need to decide on one system and make consistent metadata all the way through your projects, and that's what enables you to be able to reuse the metadata for the future. And here's this page that Guha showed you already. I'm just going to point out in the center of the page where it says collections, appraisal, and description. We have a couple of spreadsheets, 2 Excel spreadsheets you can download and use as samples in project development. And we also have some PDFs which give some supplementary information. Another thing that, another type of metadata that's really important in our archive is control vocabularies. For processing manuscript collections, we recommend that you use control vocabulary for the different document types that you have in a collection. For example, you may have day books or journals or diaries. Which term are you going to prefer to use in your own repository? So one of the sources for those terms is the Art and Architecture thesaurus, especially for paper document types. We also have the American Folklore Society ethnographic thesaurus that was developed as a partnership between the American Folklore Society and the Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. And that's now available as part of the linked data services in the Library of Congress. As you came in, I have a handout that has the URLs for many of these things, including our page at AFC. But you can see in the middle of the page here, AFS Ethnographic Thesaurus is a control vocabulary for folklore, ethnomusicology, and anthropology. It's not as good as, it wasn't created with museums in mind, and I was in a session earlier this morning where they were talking about the need for control vocabulary and for museum and object collections, which is another whole huge area of need. Although we have a lot of material culture in folklore, and it is fairly heavy on material cultural terms as well. There's also the Library of Congress has recently added some new control vocabularies to this suite of linked data. It includes the genre form thesaurus of the Library of Congress, which has musical genres and medium of a performance terms. This LC demographic group terms is a brand new release from their form and genre projects. You can also see at the bottom of the page here that the ISO standards for languages. The ISO 639-5 is the largest vocabulary with the standardized codes and language terms, and also includes the if you do RDA cataloging, it includes the control vocabulary for resource types, media types, and content types for RDA. For oral history projects, it's very important to, at least at the Library of Congress, we considered each oral history to be a multi-format collection in itself. So we had the interviews themselves, which were audiovisual media, but also sometimes still photographs of the interviewees, many times photographs that were owned or had been taken by the interviewees, or copy photographs of historic materials taken during an interview. The recording logs that were made from the after the interviews, and in the case of the Civil Rights History Project that we just completed, we were able, again, because we had enough funding available, to produce full transcripts of the interviews. For each interviewee, that becomes a sub-collection. In addition, you have, so for recording metadata, you can do it on simple paper forms, or you can do it in Excel. There's been talk here about databases, and sometimes they restrict what you think of what you can do with your metadata. And then there's various open source online tools that you can use. This is the spreadsheet that's available through our site that Guha showed you, which shows the types of metadata that we were collecting for the Civil Rights Oral History Project in the earliest stage. Since it was a joint project with the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture, we also had to map all of the data, all the metadata that we collected for this project to work in the Smithsonian dams. So we had to do metadata mapping as well as collecting there. After we started off with Excel for that project, we developed our own in-house database to collect metadata for interviews, and this is what we're currently using, not for not just any oral history projects, but for essentially any projects that we're collecting in the field that that involve interviews. So you can add an organization to it. You can register the individual people. We collect as much biographical data about persons that are interviewed as we can, including their birth dates. We establish their name authorities in the Library of Congress name authority file. We have the list of interviews, and we have a section of this collecting projects database which catalogers can use to export the data and make it available online. And this is a section of that database where people have described the still images that were associated with the interviews that they collected. And I wanted to give a shout out to this brand new publication this year that was published by ARSC, the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, which is an overall guide to audio preservation. One of the nice features of it is that it has photographs of different audio formats. You've seen a whole lot in the presentations we've done this afternoon. It's very helpful if you happen to inherit or acquire older collections of materials to be able to identify what the formats are. That will also sometimes help you date your collections because, for example, wire recordings were only made about 1948 through 52. That was the format for a short period of time. Different types of tape formats changed over time. So they have a good guide to that in this. And then Chapter 5, since I was talking about cataloging, is a really guide to describing collections, real basic resource. This I wanted to point out is if you look at folklorecollections.org, it's the National Folklore Archives Initiative. It's been underway for several years and received funding from the NEH in this last cycle to create to bring collections of folklore materials together across different small archives. who are currently in the testing stage of adding collection information. Some of the field schools that Guha and I have taught in have added the collections that the students documented. The photographs are available to be looked at in this collection. And it was developed as a cataloging tool, essentially, to get all the metadata about these audiovisual materials into a central place where then the small repositories could go ahead and make grant requests for digitization of those same materials, which is what would ultimately need to happen with them. And to remind everyone that the time-based media, audiovisual media, will not last without support from the financial support to preserve these things in digital form into the future. So we are really grateful to all the archivists, librarians, and museum curators who are on the front line of preserving and normalizing existing metadata. In other words, as you process collections and you're keeping track of every single piece of paper that's associated with something, you're often preserving the only metadata that is available for those objects. To community members and researchers and other collaborators who can correct our mistakes and enhance the description. And remind everyone, metadata is essential for resource discovery and access. We always say the field worker is the first archivist. So if you're doing your own field work, if you're making new oral history collections, you have to think about archiving from the very beginning and create new collections. Thanks very much. We'll be happy to answer any questions.